A very warm welcome to you all this evening. This is the last of the IOCS conversation days in this academic year. I'm delighted to see so many of you, some of you returning and some of you, I think, here for the first time for this evening's event. My name is Father Dragos Cerescu. I'm the principal of the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge, and I will be the moderator or a bit of a host for today's conversation. I want to say a few words before I introduce the speakers and before I say again something. I remind you all of the format of today's event. We always aim at the Institute to address subjects of relevance in the conversation days and to invite speakers who can talk with authority and insightfully on these topics, on the topics being addressed. I very much think that this is the case this evening as well, both on account of the topic and also on account of the speakers that we have this evening. We're addressing tonight religious diversity and interfaith dialogue. And this subject seems these days as relevant as ever, possibly more so given what has occupied the news for the better part of the last or the previous 2 weeks in the Middle East, at least. Both religious diversity and interfaith dialogue are valuable pursuits. But one without the other, I think, is not enough. So I think it's important to consider them together. Both of these issues shape each other and in turn help us both as individuals and communities shape our sense of self, our sense of identity, heritage, and indeed future. And I believe our two speakers this evening are perfectly placed to unpack some of the layers of this dynamic between religious diversity, identity, and interfaith dialogue. So allow me now to say just a few words about each of them, and as I said, a little bit about the format of this evening's event. Well, to say that it's a tremendous joy and slightly daunting to introduce both of them is at least, I mean, an understatement, because both of them are very close collaborators and long-standing friends, both personal and of the Institute. So I'm immensely happy that we managed, with God's help, to organize this evening event and to have both of the speakers this evening. So I'll introduce Dr. Christine Mangala Frost first. And just to say that Mangala has been, well, a long-standing, as I said, a friend, but one of the most important people in the history of the Institute. She's been there almost from the very beginning of the Institute in Cambridge. And currently she is a research associate, a guest lecturer for the Institute. She has been a member and also a director of the Institute. And along the many things that she accomplished at the Institute, one of the things was to set up, and she was a member of the committee of the Way, this sort of Orthodox catechesis course that the Institute helped sustain and come about. Mangala herself is a convert from Hinduism to Christianity and first to Anglicanism, and she is a member of the Orthodox Church now for many, many years. And part of her research and part of her work and part of her teaching has been to consider these issues of religious diversity, of conversion, of mission, of religious identity, and she continues to do that. She has written on topics like yoga in Christianity, on prayer. She has a very well, popular and also a relevant booklet entitled An Orthodox Posture on Yoga that was published in 2012 at Concilia Press. And her latest book is The Human Icon, a comparative study of Hindu and Orthodox Christian beliefs, that was published in 2017-2018 with James Clark. This evening, Mangala will use some of the research, some of the experience that she had in putting together this book to talk about this topic of religious identity, religious diversity, and interfaith dialogue. Our second speaker, just in the order of events, is Dr. Ed Kessler. Ed, as we know him, is the founder director of the Woolf Institute, which started as the Center for the Study of Jewish-Christian Relations all the way back in 1998. It became the Woolf Institute in 2010. And it continues to work, the Woolf Institute, as a center for the study of relationships between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and to foster a better understanding and dialogue and mutual collaboration between these three Abrahamic faiths. Ad is a well-known, one of the leading voices, one of the leading thinkers on these topics of interfaith relations advocacy, particularly between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Ad has written over 12 books on these topics, both in terms of interfaith dialogue, but also biblical research. And his last two publications, I think, speak for themselves. In 2013, he published Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And in 2016, he published the book entitled Jesus. I do recommend that you follow the podcast that Ed is hosting on a weekly basis called Naked Reflections. He addresses very relevant topics there. And one of the latest events one of the latest series that he was involved in was the COVID-19 Chronicles, which he initiated sort of at the height of the pandemic in 2020, which consisted of more than 50 interviews on the impact of the COVID on religion and belief, on individuals and community life. And he interviewed and engaged with a whole range of faith leaders in the field. It's an amazing testament to the times that we have lived and are living. So I will stop here to allow the time that we have for the speakers to give us their thoughts on the topic that we're here to address. So very delighted to give Christine Mangala the floor now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and greetings to all. Thank you for inviting me to contribute to this conversation on religious diversity and interfaith dialogue. I'll start with a very personal note, which is my own family is multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-faith. I won't name names, but we have Hindus, Buddhists, Orthodox Christians, Anglicans, Catholics, agnostics, and even a convert to Islam, a cousin. So over the years, I have learned to tread very carefully when we talk about our faith commitments over a cup of coffee, which often happens. These are close family, not distant, and I'm in contact with all of them. And therefore, I consider it very important, first of all, to eliminate two extreme positions. I'll just look at briefly, and they are confrontational in one way and a bit too weak on the other. And I'll briefly look at them and set aside. This is exclusivism and inclusivism. These are the extremes. Now, exclusivists are suspicious of the very idea of dialogue. They fear that their faith may become diluted and contaminated if they engage with anyone of another faith. They tend to bristle up like a porcupine and castigate other religions as either severely defective or simply dismiss them as demonic. One can find such porcupines in all religions. Now, inclusivists, on the other hand, want to achieve peace and harmony at all costs. So they play down vital differences and between religions and push for a wishy-washy commonality that resembles a jelly, sweet and sickly and wobbly. They opt for a diluted universalism that airbrushes genuine problems. Of old, the Anglican theologian John Hick moved from his Christian position, gradually kept moving it and to become a universalist. And Don Cupid with his idea of a sea of faith, again, a rather similar notion. And not just them, but many modern Hindus, gurus, exemplify this position. They are inclusivist in the sense they like to embrace everybody in their rather suffocating embrace, saying we all believe the same thing, kind of talk. Well, that's not quite true. And so I'm setting aside this extreme position and focusing on what I consider to be bridge building ventures. I believe that it is possible to suspend one's preconceptions, one's tendency to stereotype, and make an effort to understand the other, related if and where possible, without compromising one's own religious commitment. Dialogue can then become a creative process of going over to the other and then coming back to one's own to reappraise one's own faith, assess its strengths and weaknesses, and explore how one can benefit and even recognize common conundrums and problems. So dialogue, I believe, conducted as respectful conversations with courtesy, empathy, and clarity is not only desirable, but mandatory, especially for Christians. It's an important way of keeping Jesus's twofold commandment, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this commandment relates to the other biblical dictum that all human beings are made in the image of God. To love the other, who's also an image of God, we need to achieve some degree of empathy with him or her. To go over and come back means exploring whether we have anything in common, if so, what we have in common, where we diverge, and why. A respectful conversation means allowing the freedom to ask questions, often difficult questions, to acknowledge and confront what one tends to dodge, the proverbial elephant in the room. For example, as a Muslim debater put it, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is one such elephant in the room when Christians and Muslims engage in debate. I'm sure one would come across quite a few such elephants to deal with in any candid interfaith conversation. However, one can make progress when we focus on how different faiths meet basic existential issues we all share in common. The COVID crisis is an example. The search for meaning opens up various paths. The most pervasive among them, secularist humanism, or a quest for the divine based on a specific faith commitment which offers an ultimate goal, be it paradise, kingdom of heaven, samadhi, moksha, nirvana, or the pure land, whatever. Most important of all, irrespective of our background, religious or otherwise, we all seek answers to questions concerning happiness, morality, judgment, suffering, and evil. In my book, The Human Icon, which was mentioned earlier, I set out to forge a methodology inspired by two Christian approaches. The first is St. Paul's image of Christians as ambassador to act, called to act as ambassadors of Christ. The ambassadors have always a tricky position to hold. So it's not a problem-free position, but that is where we are asked to be. The second is Philip's response to Nathanael, who had asked whether anything good can come out of Nazareth. Come and see, that's what he said. Philip said to Nathanael in John 1:46. To me, these words provided the necessary guidelines for a good dialogue. Dialogue as an overture, as an invitation, respecting the freedom of the other. My goal was to provide a map of the spiritual terrain of both faiths, Hindu and Christian, and to chart routes to discover potential convergences and definitive divergences and discuss them with clarity and charity. One thing that became quickly evident was that contrary to popular perception, no religion bears a homogeneous identity. Every religion has a great variety of traditions and practices under its umbrella. This internal diversity affects our attempts to initiate a conversation. In the case of Hinduism, which has been compared to a great big banyan tree, one needs to know which branch or root we are dealing with. Vedanta, Bhakti, which means devotional love, or cults around deities like Krishna, Vishnu, Shiva, Devi, or yoga, and there are many more. This is the case with Islam and no doubt with Judaism. I think I'll stay clear of Judaism since we have the expertise of Dr. Kessler here. A dialogue in an Islamic case, which I'm working on at the moment on a book on Islam and Christian encounters in the past, a dialogue with a Sunni is bound to be different from a dialogue with a Shia or a Sufi or any other sects that we come across. So while one discovers, and sometimes very disturbed by such doctrinal variants, these traditions often share in common certain core beliefs which hold them together. So internal diversity within a religion may seem bewildering, just as it does for non-Christians. If you look at Christianity, it's the same story. The diversity is bewildering. And yet, the very variety of traditions within a religion means when one door to dialogue is shut, another may be opened with internal support. For example, in the Hindu world, the theory of karma and rebirth as biogenesis is highly dominant. Yet some of the problems in subscribing to this doctrine of karma are resolved in another Hindu tradition, the Bhakti tradition, which is equally popular. The Bhakti tradition subverts the whole karma doctrine by emphasizing God's grace, which can wipe out one's karma in one stroke. You don't need to work hard. Grace will do the job. Besides, unlike the focus on human effort, which is common to both Vedanta as well as the yoga traditions, Bhakti poets and saints speak of God as God seeking human beings, not just human beings seeking God, but God searching for human beings. In fact, there's a lovely phrase where they speak of God catches the devotee with his love with a quick, deft net, like a fish net. He catches them. And sometimes they speak of him as being the slave of slaves for human beings. Now, this is a very dramatically different way of approaching divinity or the idea of the divine than you find in the other Hindu traditions. So therefore, I feel that we need two types of dialogue. Sometimes one wonders about all the endless conferences and talks, and is it just a talk shop and blah, blah, blah stuff? I firmly believe that dialogue conducted in the ambience of academe, be it articles or books or conference papers or podcast, YouTube, internet forums, wherever, and dialogue of life, what we experience when we meet people of another faith in our day-to-day life, or in pastoral situations. which can be friendly or hostile. The scholarly work is absolutely necessary for the reason that we need to establish precise, rigorous understanding of the key doctrines, dogmas, and above all, usage of terms that seem similar yet may have very different significance. However, there is a danger of such discourses becoming too abstract and remote. They need to relate to the pastoral dimension of dialogue and vice versa. The pastoral situation can be helped by a knowledge of precise knowledge, and the knowledge offered by academe can actually help the pastoral situations for a priest, or let's say a counselor, or anybody for that matter. So when a Greek Orthodox bishop who was troubled by his people doing yoga stopped me in the corridor and asked me very bluntly, "What is yoga? Tell me, what is yoga? Is it just techniques or something more?" I think he expected an instant answer. I ended up writing a booklet explaining, the one that Father Drobos mentioned, explaining why postural yoga, which means stretching exercises, the stuff you get in a yoga class down the road, postures, and even some breathing techniques for toning the muscles and the nervous system. These have proven to be beneficial and medical by doctors and people dealing with sports injuries and stuff. And they can be practiced with Christians, but with medical advice. They do need medical advice. Yet, when these techniques morph into meditational yoga, which involves meditation in quotes, it can mean so many different things. I can't go into it right now. But when it turns into meditational yoga, which sometimes it does in the yoga classes, the practitioners need to be alert to know exactly where they're going. For the very seemingly simple breathing techniques of postural yoga, sometimes involve a kind of a deconstruction of the personality. So even if you're not religious, you still have to be alert. Otherwise, you might end up with psychotic or depressive experiences. But they also contradict they also may lead the practitioner to meditational yoga, whose goal is known as samadhi. Now, samadhi is totally incompatible with the Christian goal of the kingdom of heaven. So it would have been impossible to give a simplistic answer to the bishop's query. Hopefully, the analytical guidelines in the booklet are pastorally useful. Now, when I say dialogue of life, I mean when people face situations on a day-to-day level. When I was researching for my book in Kerala, the Indian Syrian Orthodox Christian priests and bishop I interviewed frequently spoke of the dialogue of life. For instance, when a Hindu family suffered a death and they were in their mourning for 10 days and they were not allowed to do certain things ritually forbidden. And the Christian neighbors will step in and take the children and look after them and do their shopping because they're not allowed to go out for 10 days. And they did this without any particular difficulty and the Hindus accepted it. This was one example. And another example was when a house caught fire and people were in danger, a Muslim leapt into their house to save the Hindu family, and this was reported as a kind of instantaneous pastoral act. You don't think about, are you Muslim, are you Hindu or anything Christian? They just saw a human need and leapt to action at the risk of their own life. That's what I mean by the dialogue of life, partly anyway. But the people I talked to were also referring to their everyday experience of living with Hindus in relative harmony, and how they also dealt with theological challenges and tensions at grassroots level. They had very clear guidelines about how far they could go and when they had to discipline somebody who stepped overboard and things like that. Sometimes it reminds you of the early church with their rules and regulations of putting somebody outside the community because a communion because they've done something wrong, in this case, some Hindu practice, and then bringing them back when they've repented. They have all this set in so that it can be done. Anyway, but one key aspect that really impressed me of their dialogue with Hinduism since the year dot, really, many centuries, is acculturation. Now, Christian churches in the South often adopt and adapt Hindu religious symbols and modes of celebration for their sheer beauty and fun. For instance, I was told that in one village, which is extremely traditional, during the Orthodox Christian feast of the Theophany, which is Epiphany in the West, which marks the baptism of Christ, some 15 temple elephants, and they're usually very decorative, their trunks painted in colorful hues and adorned with golden caparisons and drums and music. They're all hired for the Theophany procession to the river in this particular village. It's a fantastic, fun feast. And also, because the baptism of Christ is not only a manifestation of the Trinity, but also celebrated as a festival of the light of Christ, in the Troparion it's referred to. So Orthodox Christian households in this particular area, they adorn their porches with small earthen lamps by the dozen, lit by coconut oil, just as Southern Hindus do during their own festival of light called Kartika, where they light these earthen lamps all over. Whole streets are lit and they're really beautiful. So many Hindus may well take an imitation of their customs as a sign of respect, as a homage to the indigenous culture. But Christianization of Hindu religious symbols and adopting them and adapting them for proclaiming a Christian message can also become problematic. I'll give you a more complex example. In many churches in Kerala, including the Orthodox, one's first sight in passing through the outer precincts, through the front gate, is of a towering flagpole. It's very, very tall, beautiful in silver, and I don't think it was real gold, but it's a golden covering. Fantastic looking thing. It's an exact replica of the flagpole known as Dwajastambam that one sees in the outer precincts of South Indian temples. Exactly the same, except for the cross at the top. Now, the Hindu, such an adaptation is not just an imitative gesture, but a bold, subtle, one might say even provocative, redefinition. The Hindu's flagpole serves several functions, some practical, others religious, and even mystical. When a flag is hoisted, it serves to announce the temple festivals. There's usually an image of the deity on the flagpole, and each deity, Hindu deity, has a vehicle, like a bull or you name it. There are lots of them. And that indicates exactly who is in residence at that time in the temple. And the pole itself is often interpreted as signifying the three deities, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, who are responsible for creation, the preservation of creation, and the destruction of creation. Now, some philosophical commentators, like Shankara, invest the flagpole with deep metaphysical significance as being the primal tree. You could say the Hindu flagpole is a version of the axis mundi, connecting earth and heaven. But the yoga tradition, on the other hand, bases its interpretation on architectural principles that govern the structure of a building of a temple as a whole. According to the Hindu sacred manual on architecture, a temple is built to replicate the human body and the body of the primal man, Purusha. In the yoga reading of the temple, the flagpole represents the backbone or spine of the human body. For the spine is the pathway to the Kundalini Shakti, the yoga tradition speaks of, which is roused and it travels upwards so as to blossom in the crown of the head like a lotus. And therefore, the flagpole represents the way to the ultimate goal of enlightenment. Now, the very richness of the symbol, flagpole, as well as its obvious aesthetic and functional appeal, seems to have inspired Indian Christians to take over it and modify it, and to proclaim boldly, a simple yet challenging message that the way to God is through Christ, who has sacrificed himself for all humanity and unites heaven and earth. Christ is thus proclaimed to be the ultimate historical fulfillment of the Hindu mythic concept of Purusha, the primal man, whose sacrifice is said to initiate creation. Now, worshippers go in and they light lamps all around the base of the flagpole where there are images of saints. So you can see they've taken something and transformed it for their own purpose. While many Hindus may well take the Christian flagpole as a compliment as well as a challenge, as a visual dialogue, not all Hindus are ready to accept such an appropriation. When a Hindu-style flagpole was erected in the Roman Catholic cathedral, the famous San Tome Cathedral, which has the relics of St. Thomas, initially had until it was moved to Edessa. In 2013, they erected a pole like this. There was a vociferous Hindu protest in the media and reported in the media. People did not all Hindus were happy. Another area where dialogue has an important role to play is in clarifying the usage of terms and concepts which seem common to religions but are understood differently. For example, common terms like soul or soul-body relationship, spirit, spiritual, flesh and spirit, all these words occur in theological discussions and in different contexts. At the popular level, often on the internet and TV debates or documentaries, when people speak of something spiritual in inverted commas, there tends to be a benign fuzziness of thought. It's assumed that it's sufficient to appeal to the spiritual as being a shared common notion. In fact, when, say, Hindus and Christians speak of spirit or spiritual, they're not necessarily talking about the same thing. Put briefly, Hindu views of what constitutes the spiritual depends on a clear-cut body-soul dualism. The body may act as a locus or a conduit for the spiritual. It has no ultimate spiritual value. When one dies, the body is discarded like a worn-out garment, and only one's Atma, roughly translated as soul or self, undergoes rebirth, meaning born into another body, biogenesis. In contrast, the Judeo-Christian views of spirit and spiritual are more complex. Sometimes they get mixed up with Platonism, but when they are in the pure form, I would say they are significantly different. St. John Chrysostom makes a helpful distinction between, in a Christian usage, between soul and spirit. This is the quote: "You do not see your soul, yet you believe that you have a soul." And then he cites Genesis 2:7, where God creates man, when God creates man, then man became a living soul. God creates man by breathing into him. Man becomes a living soul. Then he adds, now as a Christian, one is to become from a living soul to a quickening spirit. But great is the difference between the two. This is still Chrysostom. Soul does not afford life to any other, but to him in whom it is. Spirit not only lives, but affords life to others also. Then, for instance, the apostles even raised the dead. Now, there's a lot to ponder here, and I don't have time, but it's certainly not the Hindu ideal of soul and spirit at all. So distinctions such as this impact on notions of salvation. In the Hindu context, it's only the soul, the Atma, that is to be saved. But in the Christian context, it's different. The Christian goal, the Hindu goal is to be released from the body, from repeated cycles of birth, which I refer to an endless journey on the circle line. You would want to get off if you were doing that. And release the spiritual component, the Atma, so that it can enter a state of bliss. That's the Hindu goal. The Christian goal is the kingdom of God, where the total human person, body reunited with the soul, along with all creation, is to be resurrected and transfigured. And it's a communal thing as well. It's not an individual, just an individual thing. Now, another example how dialogue can help us to investigate apparent similarities, which are there, and how far they're helpful or concur, and where they diverge, and why one has to make the distinctions. One such parallel is offered by the Meditational Yoga tradition and the Orthodox Christian tradition of hesychasm. Now, a frequently asked question is, what is the difference between the chanting of mantras and saying the Jesus prayer? There's a standard defense saying the Jesus prayer contains the entire of Christianity, Christian faith. In fact, that doesn't really wash well enough, because the Hindus would say the same. Their name contains the whole of the Hindu faith. So I want to focus on something else. Both traditions focus on attaining concentration, single-mindedness, through observing certain bodily postures. They take the body seriously, and they adapt sometimes some breathing techniques, yoga definitely, and also the hesychastic tradition. And both use a repetition of a formula, which embodies their religion, their faith. Now, the similarities stop there, because the two systems follow two different, what I call, maps of the body. The spiritual component of meditational yoga is envisaged primarily as an energy energy current within the body. What I would call the broken down mechanism is to be put right, sent to a repair shop and put right. But the power is within. And the spiritual journey is described in terms of an ascent and it's a trajectory from matter, through matter, to beyond matter. From the lower to the higher, from the coiled up serpentine energy, the bottom, the kundalini, the backs of the spine, to the effulging flowering of enlightenment in the crown of the head. And that is said to help the individual to merge with the cosmic. In contrast, the meditative trajectory of hesychasm is envisaged as an arrow of prayer targeted at the human heart. Heart meaning not just the organ, but the inner core of one's being. The aim of such a prayer is to purify the heart of evil passions, to renew it through the deifying energy of the Holy Spirit. I mean, this is there. It's not high theology. It's there in the prayer of the psalmist saying, create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me. That is what they are engaged in. The hesychas seek to render themselves fit for a visitation of the Holy Spirit. To be spiritual in this context does not mean changing one's psychic gear or getting the old broken down motor car repaired. That's not enough. But to prepare the body to being enlivened and energized and transfigured through an infusion of the Holy Spirit. Now, there are many more aspects of interfaith dialogue, such as reading scriptures together, and of course, doing translation work, and many more to be looked at. But right now, there's no time, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Mangala. Thank you very much for such a rich presentation in such a short time. It's not easy to do justice to all the things that one could address, but thank you so much. I must apologize. I realized in my haste to allow the speakers to talk that I failed to summarize the format for this evening. So just before I give Ed the chance to offer a brief response to Mangala, and then maybe take one or two questions, I will just remind us all of the format. So we've had the first session for about 25 to 30 minutes, the first speaker, and then there's a response and a Q&A if we can. Then we'll have a 10-minute break, and the same goes for the second session. A second speaker delivers his presentation for 20, 25, 30 minutes with a response and a Q&A. Because I think we're running a little bit behind, I will just give Ed a chance to offer a brief response, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dragos, and thank you, Mangala. I very much commend the way that you've taken the dialogue so seriously. You're right to say one of the challenges of the interfaith conversation is the vacuous nature sometimes. And the fact that you in one person combine and you have the heritage, the sort of deep personal understanding of Hinduism from your own background means that you are, you naturally have an understanding of the different aspects of Hinduism, and that comes across so well when the way that you explicate the similarities and differences. The question I wanted to ask of you, and I realize that time is limited, and something I've been intrigued as a Jew. When I look at Christianity and I look at Hinduism, and maybe you can help me or help clarify in a dialogue, we're often looking for how we can relate to one another. You touched on yoga as a natural one. I wonder if you could comment on the concept of avatar.
Yes, it comes up, yeah.
So the question is this, that the concept of God coming down on earth. Now, to an outsider who's not a Hindu and who's not a Christian, it seems to me there are some really interesting parallels in terms of the Christian story about God coming down on earth through the person of Jesus, and then God appearing through Vishnu or Shiva or whichever of the gods. And I just wonder if there's any work that's been done there. But thank you so much for your presentation.
Yes, I simply, to put it briefly, that was an idea. Well, I grew up with this, you know, Hindu, but increasingly I began to discover that these are mythic figures, you know, people who have done probably wonderful things, but they come from the epics. Krishna is a character in an epic. You may have had a historical background somewhere, but by the time he enters the Hindu worship, he's become a God coming to man in a special way to help. But interestingly, a thing in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a long poem, which is treated as scripture, but it's actually a poem within a myth, within an epic. And if you look at it, he speaks of himself as coming to quash evil and deliver the good, save the good. Now, and his advent is a temporary one. God avatars there are many of them. They come periodically from time to time, but they're always in the Christian equivalent of, what is it called? One of the heresies. It's very close to the heresy of, it was only an assumed form. I can't remember the name right now. It's gone out of my head. It'll come back. The second thing is, it's never a historical engagement. For me, I felt Hindu theories of creation, I would say, have this problem that they have several doctrines, several approaches to it, and they're all cyclical, and they're all sort of create, like the Greeks, I suppose, with existing matter, which means it's perpetual. What actually makes the big barrier between or rather difference, is the Judeo-Christian religions, they have a historical context, which meant in the beginning and in the end. That's it. We're not saying, and in the beginning and in the end, you know, forever. So this means, for me, that the historical destiny of human beings, as well as the personal history of a person, are rendered meaningless. This was my big objection to the whole avatar notion. It didn't satisfy. Okay, we can have a fine mythical figure as a type. This is how I would conduct the dialogue. There are many types, what they call types in the Orthodox understanding of other faiths, you know, in such and such a type. In fact, I got into trouble because I said Job is a type and may not have been a historical figure. And I was lambasted for that by somebody who thought I was I was going away from the Orthodox tradition. But when you look at it, the phrasing is always very carefully done about it's a type of suffering, therefore valid. So the two factors, they're like a fault line. One of the, there are two fault lines as I personally experienced, was the attitude to suffering, which because of the soul-body dualism, it gets complicated with karma and all that. And this theory of creation, which makes the avatar a kind of a fleeting figure, which people deify from myth and poetry. Early on, my grandfather was an influence on me. He was a great scholar and poet and composer and all the rest of it. He educated me a lot. When I asked him about worship, he said, "Oh, these are figures in poetry. You don't worship them," he said. Now, he was not typical, but that is the education I had. So these are literary figures, wonderful figures, but they don't actually amount to a year and a date and an event or whatever. You know. For good or ill, that's what Christianity is doing.
Thank you very much, Mangala. Thank you very much indeed, Ed, for your question to Mangala. I think we already have the making of a wonderful conversation between the two of you, and I wouldn't want to be in the way of that. But again, mindful of the time, and I think I would suggest that we take our 10-minute break now and return at 7:30.